Kung Fu is often portrayed as an unbeatable martial art, but there are just as many people who say it doesn't work at all in reality. To find out for myself if Kung Fu is a reality or a myth, I challenged a Kung Fu master to an actual fight, and I'm on my way to Germany right now to meet him, so I would learn who am I going to be going against.
The Kung Fu style I learned is predominantly about animals. So you have like the tiger and the snake, or the dragon or the crane.
The origins of this animal-inspired Kung Fu style is traced all the way back to an ancient Chinese legend about a monk named Bodhidharma, who is credited with introducing Zen Buddhism to China and laying the foundations for the now legendary Shaolin Kung Fu. As the legend goes, Bodhidharma arrived at the Shaolin Temple in 527 CE, but while today the famous temple is widely known for its incredible martial arts feats and performances, at the time it had nothing to do with martial arts at all, and was only known for its Buddhist practices and meditations. Yet Bodhidharma was not impressed. He observed that the monks at the Shaolin Temple were physically weak from extended periods of meditation and lacked the physical fitness required to endure the demanding meditation practices. Meanwhile, Bodhidharma believed that the physical health was crucial to spiritual development, so he went on a journey to find a solution to this problem. He managed to find inspiration in nature by observing various animals and developed a series of exercises and fighting techniques that imitated the movements of the creatures he observed, seeking to attain their attributes, such as imitating the tiger in order to emulate its power and strength, developing techniques that involved power-based strikes and claw-like hand movements, or imitating the crane's grace and balance, focusing on his precise strikes and flowing, evasive movements. 6 different animals were incorporated this way, including the mythical dragon, and what Bodhidharma ended up creating in order to make the monks stronger gave birth to the martial arts roots of the Shaolin Temple and a fighting style that we now know as Animal Kung Fu. While it's difficult to tell how true this story is, the practitioners of Animal Kung Fu believe that by studying and embodying the attributes of animals, they can enhance their combat abilities and develop a deeper understanding of martial arts principles. The question is though, were they successful in their endeavor? Interestingly enough, Matthias already had made an attempt at testing his Kung Fu skills before himself, but the results were far from what he expected.
After a few years of training, I thought I was really good at it. Then I went to a boxing gym and I was like, hey, I have my little sparring gloves. Let's have a few rounds. I will be careful. And that was my death sentence. So they just wiped the floor with me.
Interestingly enough, after such an experience, which is not uncommon in the martial arts world, many practitioners blame irrelevant circumstances for their lack of success, such as for example them having a bad day or the other fighter cheating, and then they fall back to training their martial art exclusively without testing it ever again. But in very few cases, the practitioner instead decides to begin questioning their martial art and start a journey of evolving from the experience. That was actually my story when I sparred an MMA fighter trying to use my Aikido and other traditional martial art, got my ass kicked, and then went on to become an amateur MMA fighter. Luckily, Matthias also chose this path. After his beating in the boxing gym, he chose to pursue combat sports, eventually opening up his MMA gym, and he even began organizing the biggest martial arts and combat sports festival in Europe. That this year, he invited me to teach my functional Aikido at, a version of my martial art that I made practical. While it was an incredible experience to share my newly gained knowledge with martial arts enthusiasts, in an event that became a reality only because of Matthias' initial disillusionment with Kung Fu and his willingness to grow, we were still yet to find out not only how Matthias will do using pure Kung Fu in sparring, while I'll be using kickboxing against him, but we will also try to pit my improved functional Aikido against his traditional Kung Fu to see how much I managed to improve my martial art and to see how it compares to Kung Fu.
What are your expectations for the sparring?
Maybe the techniques will be slower than modern MMA techniques, but on the other hand, I think you may have a hard time doing locks because it was a big part of the Kung Fu training to be flexible and move your joints and to expand the limit of the human possible range of motion.
After doing some warm-ups, it was time to find out the truth. As we began the sparring, initially I was struggling to respond, as Matthias's movements were so awkward and unusual that it made it difficult to throw countering strikes back at him. As a result, I started off by keeping my distance and giving myself more time to become familiar with reading his moves. Eventually though, I started seeing openings and began using them against him. Yet then Matthias moved into a more defensive mode, blocking many of my strikes with his unusual animalistic moves. I was also impressed by how Matthias was keeping true to the Kung Fu techniques, making sure that he would stick with his original style for the sake of the experiment, while he could easily switch to using kickboxing as well. But while Matthias was struggling to hit me with those big telegraphed moves that I could easily see coming, his Kung Fu defense was not that bad. Yet then what we found out was that all of those big and complicated moves that Matthias was throwing and performing pretty much non-stop throughout the entire sparring was actually very taxing on his body.
We had a short sparring round that the techniques are so much focused on consuming energy, on wide techniques, on big movements. Yeah, I'm pretty gassed out.
On the one hand though, that wasn't a surprise, since the words themselves Kung Fu are often translated as skill or expertise acquired through dedication and hard work. It is so common to see Kung Fu practitioners standing in a horse stance for long periods of time or doing various cardio-heavy exercises, perhaps preparing themselves to use their physically demanding style. At the same time, Kung Fu is a style that was developed hundreds of years ago and has hardly evolved over time, while such practices as boxing or kickboxing, combat sports that were forced to evolve due to constant competition, became much more effective and efficient in how they use their techniques. Before we went on to do a Kung Fu versus Aikido sparring, what stood out to me even more though was the intended application of the unusual animalistic movements.
Because of boxing gloves, you may not be able to see it. Like this is supposed to snake. The idea is the snake can block and goes expand and go for body parts that you in a normal combat sport wouldn't attack, but that are vulnerable in the body. Go for the eyes, go for the jugular. The tiger would also go for the groin.
Yeah. Oh no.
Ideally,
Claws, right? Like
claws
and nails, I guess.
yes, like a tiger. You're doing
So essentially now you're being nice to me and wearing gloves and you're not using fingers.
in a way, but in a way, you've been nice to me too.
This actually made a lot of sense, as when Kung Fu was developed, winning at sports was not a priority. Instead, it was all about survival and defeating your opponent as quickly as possible. That's where such methods as gouging the eyes or striking the throat, methods that may be harder to pull off successfully than some people think, come into play. But does that mean I was impressed by how Kung Fu works in fighting and became inspired to incorporate it into my style? Not really. While animal Kung Fu may be a style that worked well 1,000 years ago, when it didn't have other evolved martial arts styles to compete against, and when its practitioners were most likely battle testing and adapting the techniques in actual fighting all the time, most Kung Fu practitioners these days train cooperatively, never applying their techniques under pressure, leading to terrible results once they try to apply it against experienced fighters. It is also potentially a martial art that suffers from a lack of innovation and evolution. As in most traditional styles, the main focus is not to make the style functional, but instead to preserve the technique the way they were taught it from master to master, generation to generation, leading to their students learning outdated methods, while effective combat sports evolved and kept adapting at incredible speeds. But what happens when people take their traditional martial art and try to evolve it? We were about to find out at least a piece of that answer by having one more sparring session, this time pitting Matthias's Kung Fu against my improved Aikido to see how a traditional style does against a modified one. Once again, I experienced the same difficulty as at first.
God, you're scary with those.
Matthias's movements were so unusual that it was difficult for me to enter and engage into a clinch, the area where most Aikido techniques work best. Eventually though, I did find a way to close the distance. Yet when I tried a couple of modified Aikido techniques, Matthias's flexibility did prove to be a challenge, so I had to disengage. I kept looking for ways to engage again, until eventually I managed to enter and pulled off the first Aikido wrist lock to a foot sweep. But the question still was, will I be able to apply other Aikido techniques on Matthias? After a few exchanges, I managed to close the distance again, and performed an Aikido takedown, then another wrist lock, and then another takedown. But then during my final technique attempt, Matthias used his flexibility to spin out. I then still got into a dominant position, but then as soon as I let go, he killed me with his snake strike to my throat. Does that mean animal Kung Fu works? Probably not. But if it were given an opportunity to evolve while staying with its original purpose of injuring an opponent as quickly as possible, who knows, maybe it would. If you want to watch my full functional Aikido seminar, go to martialartsjourney.thinkific.com. If you want to see my Aikido sparring versus judo, click here. And as always, keep owning your journey.